My name is Harper, and am 23 years old, standing barefoot in 14-degree weather on Christmas Eve, while my own father locks me out of our family home. The snow is falling so thick I can barely see past the front porch, and my breath creates little clouds that disappear into the darkness. But that's not the strangest part of this nightmare. The strangest part is seeing my dead grandmother's silhouette through the living room window, holding a vintage leather suitcase and smiling at me like she's been waiting for this moment for 5 years. Before we dive into this insane story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button if you've ever felt betrayed by family, and don't forget to subscribe because this tale gets more twisted than you could ever imagine. Trust me, what happens next will make you question everything you think you know about family loyalty and revenge from beyond the grave. Let me take you back 8 months to understand how I ended up frozen on my own doorstep. My mother, Catherine, died from breast cancer when I was 15, leaving behind a void that my father Richard thought he could fill by marrying Miranda Ashford just 2 years later. Miranda came complete with her own children, Sienna, who was 18 at the time, and Blake, who was 16. They moved into our house like they owned it, and honestly, within months, it felt like they did. Miranda had this way of redecorating everything, erasing any trace of my mother's presence while claiming she was just trying to make the space feel fresh and welcoming for everyone. The family photos got rearranged, my mother's garden got replanted with Miranda's preferred flowers, and even the kitchen got completely renovated to suit her cooking style. My grandmother Evelyn had always been the strongest woman I knew, a self-made billionaire who built her empire from nothing and never apologized for her success. She lived in a stunning Manhattan penthouse and owned properties across the globe. But more importantly, she saw right through Miranda from day one. During family dinners, I'd catch Grandma Evelyn watching Miranda with these calculating eyes, like she was solving a puzzle nobody else could see. She'd ask pointed questions about Miranda's past, her previous marriage, her financial situation before meeting my father. Miranda would laugh and deflect, but I noticed how her smile never quite reached her eyes when Grandma Evelyn was around. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife, especially when discussions turned to family finances or future inheritance plans. When Grandma Evelyn died 5 years ago from what the doctors called a sudden heart attack, Miranda's grief seemed performative at best. She cried at the funeral, sure, but I noticed how quickly she inquired about the will reading and how disappointed she looked when she learned that the bulk of the estate was going to various charities, with only modest amounts designated for family members. The penthouse was supposedly going to be sold, with proceeds split between my father and his siblings, while I would receive a small trust fund for college expenses. Miranda seemed almost relieved by this arrangement, like she'd been worried about a different outcome. What none of us knew at the time was that Grandma Evelyn had been planning something far more elaborate than any of us could imagine. Over the years since the remarriage, it'd been slowly pushed to the margins of my own family. Sienna got the bigger bedroom that used to be mine, claiming she needed more space for her art supplies. Blake took over the basement recreation room for his gaming setup, leaving me with nowhere to hang out with friends. My father, desperate to keep peace with his new wife, always sided with Miranda's children when conflicts arose. I found myself working part-time jobs throughout high school just to afford basic necessities that Miranda deemed unnecessary expenses, like new clothes or school supplies beyond the absolute minimum. She had this passive-aggressive way of making me feel like a burden, sighing dramatically whenever I asked for anything, and mentioning how tight money was getting with 4 kids to support. The gaslighting was subtle but constant. Miranda would move my belongings and then act confused when I couldn't find them. She'd make family plans without including me, then apologize profusely when I found out, claiming she simply forgot to mention it. Sienna and Blake learned to mimic their mother's behavior, treating me like an outsider who was lucky to be tolerated in their space. They'd have family movie nights without inviting me, take family photos when I wasn't around, and create inside jokes that deliberately excluded me from conversations. My father either didn't notice these dynamics or chose to ignore them, always busy with work or distracted by Miranda's constant need for attention and validation. Christmas Eve started like any other day in our dysfunctional household. I'd been working a double shift at the local coffee shop to save money for spring semester textbooks, since Miranda had convinced my father that my part-time job should cover all my educational expenses beyond tuition. The shop was busier than usual, with last-minute gift buyers grabbing coffee and pastries, and my manager asked if I could stay late to help with closing duties. I agreed, knowing I needed the extra hours, even though it meant missing whatever family dinner Miranda had planned. Honestly, I was relieved to avoid another evening of forced conversation and passive-aggressive comments about my absence from family activities. When I finally made it home around 11:30 p.m., exhausted and smelling like espresso, I used my key to enter through the front door as quietly as possible. The house was mostly dark except for some lights coming from the living room, and I could hear voices having what sounded like an intense conversation. As I hung up my coat and kicked off my work shoes, I realized the voices were coming from my bedroom upstairs. Confused and increasingly alarmed, I climbed the stairs and found my bedroom door wide open with Miranda inside, going through my dresser drawers and closet with methodical precision. She had pulled out boxes from under my bed, emptied my jewelry box onto the comforter, and was currently rifling through my desk drawers like she was searching for something specific. The sight of someone violating my personal space so completely made my blood boil. I'd never felt such a combination of rage and violation as I watched this woman treating my belongings like they were hers to investigate. When I demanded to know what she was doing, Miranda didn't even look startled or guilty. Instead, she turned around with this cold, calculated expression and accused me of stealing a diamond necklace that had belonged to my grandmother Evelyn. She claimed the necklace had gone missing from her jewelry collection and that I was the only person who could have taken it, since I was the only one who'd shown interest in Grandma Evelyn's belongings after the funeral. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. I'd never stolen anything in my life, and the idea that Miranda would accuse me of taking something that belonged to my own grandmother felt like the ultimate betrayal. I tried to explain that I hadn't even seen the necklace she was describing, that I'd been working non-stop and barely spent time in the house lately, but Miranda's voice kept getting louder and more hysterical. She started throwing around words like theft and betrayal, claiming I'd always been jealous of Sienna and Blake, and that this was my way of getting back at the family. The absurdity of her accusations made me realize this was about more than just a missing necklace. This felt orchestrated, like she'd been planning this confrontation for a while. By the time my father appeared in the doorway, Miranda had worked herself into a state of righteous fury that would have been impressive if it wasn't so obviously manufactured. She told Richard that she'd caught me red-handed going through her jewelry box earlier in the evening, which was physically impossible since I'd been at work until 30 minutes ago. She claimed I'd been acting suspicious lately, sneaking around the house and asking too many questions about Grandma Evelyn's will and estate distribution. None of this was true. But Miranda delivered each lie with such conviction that I could see my father's expression changing from confusion to disappointment to something approaching anger. Richard looked at me with these tired, defeated eyes and asked why I would do something like this to Miranda, why I couldn't just accept that we were a blended family and stop causing problems. The fact that he automatically believed her story without asking for any evidence or considering my side of things felt like a knife twisting in my chest. This was my father, the man who used to read me bedtime stories and teach me how to ride a bike, and he was treating me like a criminal based on the word of a woman he'd known for less than 5 years. When I tried to defend myself, to point out the inconsistencies in Miranda's story, he held up his hand and told me he was tired of the constant drama and tension in his house. Miranda, seeing that she had Richard's support, doubled down on her performance. She started crying about how hard she'd tried to be a good stepmother, how she'd always treated me like her own daughter, and how heartbroken she was to discover that I'd been stealing from her. She claimed she'd been missing jewelry for months, but had been afraid to say anything because she didn't want to cause family drama. Now, she said, she had no choice but to protect her own children from my influence. Sienna and Blake appeared in the hallway like they'd been waiting for their cue, both looking at me with expressions of disappointment and betrayal that seemed far too practiced to be genuine. The situation escalated when Miranda demanded that I empty my pockets and my purse to prove I didn't have the necklace on me. The humiliation of being treated like a common thief in my own home was overwhelming, but I complied, pulling out my work uniform, my tips from the day, my house keys, and my phone. When the search revealed nothing incriminating, Miranda claimed I must have hidden the necklace somewhere else in the house, or possibly given it to a friend to hold on to. She suggested calling the police to file a theft report, which sent my father into a panic about potential scandal and embarrassment for the family name. That's when Richard made the decision that would change everything between us forever. He told me that until I was ready to tell the truth about what he'd done with the necklace and apologize to Miranda for betraying her trust, I was not welcome in his house. He said I could come back when I was ready to take responsibility for my actions and make amends to the family it hurt. The words came out of his mouth like he was reading from a script, and I realized that Miranda had probably been working on him for weeks, planting seeds of doubt about my character and my loyalty to the family unit they'd created. I tried one last time to reason with him, to remind him that I was his daughter and that I'd never given him any reason to doubt my honesty or integrity. I pointed out that Miranda couldn't even describe the allegedly stolen necklace in detail, that she had no proof of when it supposedly went missing, and that her entire story fell apart under basic scrutiny. But Richard had already made his decision, influenced by a woman who had systematically worked to poison him against his own child. He told me to take my coat and leave, and to not come back until I was ready to confess and apologize. The front door closed behind me with a finality that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. I stood on the porch for several minutes, waiting for someone to open the door and tell me this had all been some terrible misunderstanding. Instead, I watched through the window as the living room lights went out one by one, leaving me alone in the falling snow with nowhere to go and no one to call. My phone showed multiple missed calls from coworkers asking if I wanted to join them for late-night Christmas Eve drinks, but I couldn't bring myself to explain why I was suddenly homeless on the most family-oriented night of the year. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and I realized I was wearing nothing but the thin sweater I'd worn to work under my coffee shop apron. My feet were already numb in my sneakers, and the snow was starting to soak through the canvas material. I tried knocking on the door again, calling out to my father and reminding him that I could literally freeze to death out here, but the house remained dark and silent. The garage was locked, the back door was bolted shut, and even the doghouse in the backyard was secured with a padlock. Miranda had apparently thought of everything. As hypothermia began to set in and I started to lose feeling in my fingers and toes, I noticed a warm glow coming from the living room window. Through the frosted glass, I could make out a figure standing near the Christmas tree, and my heart nearly stopped when I recognized the silhouette. It was my grandmother Evelyn, wearing the same elegant coat shed worn to church every Sunday for as long as I could remember. She was holding an old-fashioned leather suitcase and looking directly at me through the window, with the same knowing smile she'd always given me when I was in trouble and needed her help. The front door swung open silently, even though I'd just watched my father lock it and turn off all the lights. The house was completely quiet as I stepped inside, my frozen feet barely able to feel the hardwood floor beneath them. The living room was empty now, but I could smell my grandmother's signature perfume lingering in the air, a delicate blend of vanilla and roses that she'd worn for decades. On the coffee table sat the leather suitcase I'd seen her holding through the window, vintage and well-traveled with brass corners and her initials E.M.H. embossed on the front. My hands were shaking so badly from the cold and shock that I could barely work the clasps, but when the case finally opened, I found it filled with documents that would change everything. The first thing I pulled out was a handwritten letter in my grandmother's distinctive script, written on her personal letterhead with the fountain pen she'd always preferred over modern alternatives. As I read her words by the light of the Christmas tree, I felt like she was sitting right beside me, speaking directly into my ear with that mix of warmth and steel that had made her such a formidable businesswoman. She explained that she'd suspected Miranda's true nature from their very first meeting and had spent months investigating her background before reaching some disturbing conclusions about her character and her intentions toward our Plisson family. Grandma Evelyn had discovered that Miranda's previous marriage had ended under suspicious circumstances, with her first husband dying in what was ruled an accidental drowning despite several insurance policies that had been taken out just months before his death. Shed found evidence of financial manipulation and elder abuse in Miranda's past, including a case where Shed convinced an elderly neighbor to change his will before he died under questionable circumstances. Most shocking of all, Grandma Evelyn had uncovered proof that Miranda had been systematically poisoning her with small doses of digitalis over the course of several months, causing the heart problems that eventually led to her death. The letter explained that the will reading 5 years ago had been a complete fabrication, designed to test the family's reaction and see how they behaved when they thought they weren't inheriting the bulk of her fortune. The real will, which Grandma Evelyn had kept secret with the help of her longtime attorney Gregory Hartwell, left everything to me, including the Manhattan penthouse, various investment properties, and a liquid fortune worth over $50 million. She'd known that Miranda would eventually reveal her true colors if she thought there was no significant inheritance to pursue, and she'd been right. Inside the suitcase were also keys to a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Manhattan, along with detailed instructions for accessing the real will and other evidence Shed collected about Miranda's criminal activities. There were photographs of financial documents, recorded conversations, and even video footage of Miranda entering Grandma Evelyn's apartment building on the day she died, despite claiming she'd been out of town that entire week. My grandmother had been building a case against Miranda for months before her death, knowing that she might not survive long enough to see justice served but determined to protect me from the same fate. The final part of the letter was a detailed plan for exposing Miranda and reclaiming what was rightfully mine. Grandma Evelyn had anticipated that Miranda would eventually try to drive me out of the family completely, either through false accusations or worse, and Shed prepared contingencies for various scenarios. Shed already arranged for Gregory Hartwell to monitor the situation and intervene if necessary, and Shed set up a secure communication system that would allow me to access help when I needed it most. Most importantly, Shed gathered enough evidence to send Miranda to prison for multiple murders if the authorities could be convinced to reopen the cases. Reading that letter felt like having my grandmother back from the dead, guiding me through the darkness with the same fierce protection Shed always shown me when I was alive. I could practically hear her voice telling me to be strong, to be smart, and to never let anyone make me feel small or powerless. Shed always said that the best revenge was a life well lived, but Shed also taught me that sometimes you have to fight for your right to live that life. The tools Shed left me would give me the power to fight back against Miranda's manipulation and reclaim not just my inheritance, but my father and my place in the family. The house suddenly felt different as I sat there in the Christmas tree's glow, surrounded by evidence of my grandmother's love and foresight. This wasn't just about money or property. It was about justice for a woman who'd been murdered by someone Shed welcomed into her family. Miranda had underestimated both my grandmother's intelligence and her determination to protect the people she loved. Shed thought she was dealing with a naive young woman who could be easily manipulated and discarded, but she was about to discover that Evelyn Morrison Hartwell had raised her granddaughter to be every bit as formidable as she was. As I carefully put everything back into the suitcase and prepared to hide it somewhere safe, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Miranda, Sienna, and Blake were coming downstairs, probably to gloat over their successful manipulation of my father and my banishment from the family. They had no idea that everything was about to change, that their victim had just received the tools needed to become their worst nightmare. I had a choice to make. I could reveal everything immediately and watch their world crumble. Or I could play the long game the way my grandmother would have, gathering more evidence and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Over the next few weeks, I played the role of the defeated daughter perfectly while secretly building my case against Miranda and her children. I moved into a small studio apartment near campus using money from my work savings, telling my father I needed space to think about my actions and figure out how to make amends to the family. Richard seemed relieved that I was taking responsibility for the supposed theft, and Miranda played the role of the magnanimous stepmother who was willing to forgive if I proved myself worthy of redemption. What they didn't know was that I was using this time to coordinate with Gregory Hartwell and compile additional evidence of their crimes. Miranda's confidence in her victory made her careless, and she began revealing more of her true nature now that she thought I was completely powerless. She started phase 2 of what I now realized was a long-term plan to completely erase my connection to the family and claim everything my father owned for herself and her children. The first attack came through my university, where I received a call from the registrar's office informing me that my enrollment had been suspended due to concerns about my mental health and allegations of criminal behavior. Someone had called pretending to be my father, reporting that I'd been exhibiting erratic behavior and had been caught stealing from family members. The administration was understandably concerned about allowing a potentially unstable student to remain in classes, especially given that I was studying psychology and would eventually be working with vulnerable populations. I tried to explain that the accusations were false and that I could provide evidence of my work schedule proving I couldn't have committed the alleged crimes, but the damage was already done. The suspension would remain in place until I could provide psychiatric evaluation and character references from family members, which Miranda had made impossible by poisoning everyone against me. Sienna took the attack to social media, posting carefully crafted messages about how heartbroken she was to discover that her stepsister had been stealing from their family for months. She shared what looked like evidence of the supposed theft, including photos of jewelry and other valuables that she claimed I'd taken from various family members. The posts were designed to look like authentic emotional responses from a hurt family member, but I noticed how calculated the timing was and how perfectly the narrative aligned with Miranda's version of events. Within hours, the posts had been shared hundreds of times by classmates and acquaintances who believed they were supporting an innocent victim. Blake played his role as the reluctant witness, posting his own message about how difficult it was to come forward about a family member's criminal behavior. He claimed he'd seen me going through Miranda's jewelry collection multiple times but had been afraid to say anything because he didn't want to cause family drama. His post included screenshots of text messages that appeared to show me asking suspicious questions about valuable items in the house, but I knew these messages had been fabricated because I rarely texted with Blake and certainly never discussed Miranda's possessions with him. The social media campaign was devastatingly effective at destroying my reputation among peers and professors who had no reason to doubt the sincerity of what appeared to be heartbroken family members. Friends started avoiding me. Study groups suddenly found reasons to exclude me, and professors who had previously been supportive began treating me with suspicion and disappointment. The isolation was exactly what Miranda had intended, cutting off any potential sources of emotional support that might help me fight back against her manipulation. But Miranda's biggest mistake was underestimating my capacity to learn from her tactics and use them against her. I'd been quietly documenting everything, taking screenshots of social media posts before they could be deleted, recording phone conversations with university officials, and keeping detailed notes about every interaction with family members. Gregory Hartwell had taught me how to gather evidence methodically and legally, building a case that would stand up in court when the time came to reveal the truth. The private investigator that Miranda had hired to follow me was named Dallas Reagan, and he was about as subtle as a brick through a window. I spotted him within days of moving to my new apartment, partly because he drove a distinctive black sedan, and partly because Gregory had taught me what to look for in surveillance operations. Instead of confronting him directly, I decided to use his presence to my advantage, feeding him false information and leading him to believe I was planning to leave town permanently to escape the shame of my alleged crimes. The most painful betrayal came when I discovered that my closest friend from high school, Tiffany Chen, had been recruited into Miranda's web of deception. We'd maintained our friendship throughout college despite going to different schools, and I'd confided in her about the family problems I'd been experiencing. What I didn't know was that Miranda had approached her months earlier, offering to pay her for information about my activities and emotional state. Tiffany had been feeding Miranda details about my work schedule, my financial situation, my relationships with professors and classmates, and even my private conversations about feeling isolated from my family. The discovery of Tiffany's betrayal happened by accident when I found a GPS tracking device hidden in my backpack after a study session at her apartment. The device was sophisticated and expensive, definitely not something a college student could afford on her own. When I confronted her about it, Tiffany broke down and admitted that Miranda had been paying her $500 a month for information, with promises of much larger payments, if she could provide evidence of erratic behavior or criminal activity. She claimed she needed the money for tuition and hadn't realized how serious the situation was until it was too late to back out without facing consequences herself. Learning that even my closest friend had been bought and turned against me was almost more devastating than losing my family. Tiffany had been present for some of my most vulnerable moments, including conversations where Eid questioned my own sanity and wondered if maybe I really was the problem in my family dynamic. Shed encouraged me to doubt myself while secretly recording our conversations and reporting back to the woman who was systematically destroying my life. The level of calculation and cruelty required to maintain such a deception for months was staggering. But even this betrayal provided valuable intelligence about Miranda's operations and mindset. Through Tiffany, I learned that Miranda was planning something much bigger than just driving me away from the family. She'd been asking detailed questions about my relationship with my grandmother, whether Id ever mentioned receiving anything valuable from her, and whether I seemed to know anything about hidden assets or secret accounts. Miranda was clearly still hunting for my grandmother's real fortune, probably suspicious that the official will hadn't told the whole story. The noose was tightening around my neck as Miranda's campaign of destruction gained momentum, but I was also gathering the evidence I'd need to hang her with her own rope. Every attack she launched against me was being documented and preserved, every lie was being exposed through careful investigation, and every collaborator in her scheme was being identified for future prosecution. My grandmother had taught me that patience and preparation were the keys to victory against a superior opponent, and I was about to put those lessons to the ultimate test. The third wave of Miranda's assault came when I least expected it, striking at the very foundation of my relationship with my father in a way that almost broke my resolve to see this through to the end. Richard called me on a Thursday evening in late January, asking if I could meet him for dinner at our old favorite restaurant downtown. His voice sounded different, strained and formal in a way that immediately put me on guard, but I agreed to meet him because I thought this might be my chance to finally tell him the truth about what was happening to our family. The restaurant was nearly empty when I arrived, which should have been my first warning that something was wrong. Richard was already seated at a corner booth, and had brought someone with him, a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Brennan Cole, allegedly a psychiatrist who specialized in treating young adults with behavioral problems and substance abuse issues. My father explained that had been consulting with Dr. Cole about my recent behavioral changes and the escalating problems at home, and that the doctor had recommended a treatment program that could help me get my life back on track. As Dr. Cole began asking me personal questions about my mental health, my relationship with my family, and my alleged criminal behavior, I realized this was an ambush designed to create a medical record that would support Miranda's narrative about my instability. Every question was loaded, designed to elicit responses that could be twisted to support a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder or substance abuse problems. When I refused to answer most of his questions and demanded to know why my father thought I needed psychiatric evaluation, Dr. Cole made notes about my defensive behavior and resistance to treatment. The conversation took an even darker turn when Richard revealed that he'd been speaking with lawyers about pursuing conservatorship over my financial affairs and medical decisions. He claimed that my recent behavior had convinced him that I was not capable of making rational decisions about my own life, and that he needed legal authority to ensure I received proper treatment before I hurt myself or someone else. The papers he showed me would essentially strip away my rights as an adult and give him complete control over every aspect of my life, including access to any inheritance or trust funds I might eventually receive. The betrayal was so complete and devastating that I could barely process what was happening. This was my father, the man who had raised me and claimed to love me unconditionally, trying to have me declared mentally incompetent based on lies fabricated by his wife. He was planning to steal my legal autonomy and my inheritance, using the same woman who had murdered my grandmother and was now systematically destroying my life. The Richard sitting across from me looked like my father, but the words coming out of his mouth belonged to a stranger who had been completely corrupted by Miranda's manipulation. I refused to sign any of the documents they presented, which prompted Dr. Cole to make additional notes about my oppositional behavior and lack of insight into my own mental health issues. He suggested that involuntary commitment might be necessary if I continued to resist treatment, particularly given the serious nature of the criminal allegations against me. The threat was crystal clear. Either agree to the conservatorship voluntarily or be forcibly committed to a psychiatric facility where I would have no rights and no ability to fight back against their plans. When I demanded to know how my father could possibly believe that I needed psychiatric treatment based on false accusations of theft, Richard's response revealed just how thoroughly Miranda had poisoned him against me. He told me about surveillance footage that allegedly showed me entering the house at unusual hours, about witness statements from neighbors who claimed they'd seen me acting suspiciously, and about expert testimony regarding my psychological profile and predisposition toward criminal behavior. None of this evidence existed, but Richard had been convinced that it was real, and that I was simply too mentally ill to understand the seriousness of my situation. The most insidious part of Miranda's psychological manipulation was how she'd made my father doubt his own memories and perceptions of who I was as a person. She'd convinced him that my academic achievements were the result of cheating, that my work ethic was actually a sign of obsessive-compulsive disorder, and that my close relationship with my grandmother had been motivated by greed rather than genuine love. Every positive quality it ever displayed had been reframed as evidence of mental illness or moral deficiency, creating a narrative that justified any action taken against me. I left that restaurant knowing that I'd lost my father completely, at least temporarily, and that Miranda's plan was moving into its final phase. She wasn't content with just driving me away from the family. She wanted to destroy my legal capacity to fight back and claim everything that was rightfully mine. The conservatorship would give Richard control over my inheritance when it was eventually revealed, and Miranda would control Richard, effectively stealing my grandmother's fortune and getting away with murder in the process. But Miranda had made a crucial error in bringing Dr. Cole into her scheme, because Gregory Hartwell had been monitoring all of Richard's financial transactions and legal consultations as part of our ongoing investigation. We discovered that Brennan Cole wasn't actually a licensed psychiatrist at all, but rather an actor named Wade Morrison, who specialized in insurance fraud and had been hired to play a role in what was essentially an elaborate confidence game. His fake medical credentials were convincing enough to fool my father, but they wouldn't stand up to professional scrutiny. The fake doctor scheme provided us with concrete evidence of conspiracy and fraud that went far beyond simple family manipulation. Miranda was now guilty of multiple felonies, including identity theft, medical fraud, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping, since involuntary psychiatric commitment under false pretenses qualified as unlawful imprisonment. We had recordings of the entire dinner conversation, documentation of Wade Morrison's real identity and criminal history, and proof that Miranda had paid him to participate in the scheme. As I sat in my car outside the restaurant, watching my father drive away with a man who was helping him destroy his own daughter's life, I felt the last vestiges of my old naive self finally die. The Harper who had spent years making excuses for her family's behavior and hoping things would eventually get better was gone forever. In her place was someone harder, smarter, and absolutely committed to bringing down the people who had underestimated what she was capable of when pushed beyond her breaking point. By March, Miranda had grown confident enough in her control over the situation that she decided to move forward with the most dangerous part of her plan. The conservatorship hearing had been scheduled for April 15th, and she needed me eliminated before then to prevent any possibility of me revealing the truth about my grandmother's real will. What she didn't know was that Gregory Hartwell and I had been monitoring all of her communications and financial transactions, giving us advance warning of what was coming in time to prepare our own countermoves. The setup was elaborate and showed just how far Miranda was willing to go to protect her stolen fortune. Wade Morrison, the fake psychiatrist, had prepared a detailed psychiatric evaluation claiming that I was severely mentally ill and posed a danger to myself and others. The evaluation included fabricated statements from family members, falsified medical records going back to childhood, and expert testimony about my alleged history of violent behavior and substance abuse. The document was convincing enough that any judge who reviewed it would almost certainly approve the conservatorship and possibly order immediate psychiatric commitment. But the evaluation was just the beginning of Miranda's final plan. She'd also been working with Dallas Reagan, the private investigator, to create evidence that I was planning to harm family members who had tried to help me. They'd fabricated threatening letters allegedly written by me, staged photographs of vandalism at the family home, and even created false witness statements from neighbors who claimed they'd seen me lurking around the property at night. The plan was to present me as someone who had escalated from theft to more serious crimes and needed to be stopped before I seriously hurt someone. The most chilling part of the plan was revealed when we intercepted communications between Miranda and someone called Sterling Price, who turned out to be a professional killer shed hired to stage my suicide. The plan was to make it look like I'd killed myself rather than face the shame of being exposed as a thief and being committed to psychiatric treatment. Sterling had been studying my routines and habits for weeks, waiting for the right opportunity to make my death look like a convincing suicide that would generate sympathy for my family, rather than suspicion about their role in driving me to desperation. Miranda had thought of everything, including how to handle the investigation that would follow my death. She'd prepared evidence suggesting that I'd been planning suicide for months, including fake journal entries that she'd planted in my apartment during one of Dallas Reagan's surveillance visits. She'd even arranged for Tiffany to discover my body and provide testimony about my deteriorating mental state in the weeks leading up to my death. The plan was so comprehensive and professionally executed that it would almost certainly have succeeded if we hadn't been monitoring every aspect of it. Learning that my stepmother was planning to have me murdered was somehow less shocking than discovering how thoroughly she'd corrupted my father and turned him into an accomplice. Richard wasn't just passively allowing Miranda to destroy me. He was actively participating in the conspiracy by providing legal cover for her actions and using his parental authority to legitimize her claims about my mental health. Head signed affidavits supporting the conservatorship petition, met with Sterling Price under the guise of hiring private security, and even helped prepare the fake evidence that would be used to justify my commitment to psychiatric treatment. The realization that my own father was willing to participate in my murder rather than question his wife's version of events was devastating beyond words. This wasn't just betrayal. It was complete moral collapse by someone who had once been the most important person in my world. Miranda hadn't just stolen my inheritance and my family. She'd turned my father into the kind of person who could watch his daughter die and feel relieved that she was no longer causing problems for his new family. But Miranda's confidence in her plan made her careless about operational security, and she'd underestimated both Gregory's resources and his commitment to honoring my grandmother's memory. We'd been building our own case for months, gathering evidence not just about the current conspiracy but about the original murder of my grandmother and Miranda's previous crimes against other victims. We had recordings of planning sessions, financial records showing payments to various criminals, and even video footage of Miranda meeting with Sterling Price to finalize the assassination plan. The decision to let Miranda's plan proceed to the point where she would commit additional felonies was difficult, but Gregory convinced me that we needed overwhelming evidence to ensure successful prosecution. Half measures wouldn't be enough to bring down someone with Miranda's resources and connections. We needed proof of crimes so serious that no amount of money or influence could make them disappear. My fake death would give us that proof, but it also meant putting myself at considerable risk and trusting that our countermeasures would work perfectly. The trap we set was as elaborate as Miranda's own plan and drew on every lesson my grandmother had taught me about patience, preparation, and the importance of controlling information flow. We let Miranda believe that her surveillance was giving her accurate intelligence about my movements and emotional state, while actually feeding her false information that would lead her into making mistakes. We documented every aspect of her conspiracy while building our own network of allies within law enforcement and the legal system. As April 15th approached, and the final confrontation drew near, I felt my grandmother's presence more strongly than ever, as if she was watching from beyond the grave to see whether her careful planning and my determination would be enough to bring justice for her murder and protect other potential victims from Miranda's predatory behavior. The scared, isolated young woman who had been locked out in the snow on Christmas Eve was gone, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes the only way to protect the people you love is to destroy the people who threaten them. The final confrontation was set for April 20th at the downtown offices of Hartwell and Associates, where Gregory had arranged what Miranda believed would be a negotiation session about my surrender of any claims to my grandmother's estate. She thought she was coming to accept my complete capitulation and formalize the transfer of any remaining assets to my father's control. What she was actually walking into was a carefully orchestrated sting operation that would capture her confession to multiple murders and document her entire criminal enterprise in excruciating detail. Gregory had prepared the conference room like a movie set, with hidden cameras and recording devices positioned to capture every word and gesture from multiple angles. The room looked like a standard legal office, complete with law books and formal furniture, but every surface contained sophisticated surveillance equipment that would provide crystal-clear documentation of whatever Miranda chose to reveal. Wed even arranged for Detective Jasmine Santos to be present in an adjoining room, ready to make arrests the moment we had enough evidence to proceed with criminal charges. Detective Santos had been investigating Miranda's activities independently after receiving anonymous tips about suspicious deaths connected to her previous marriages and relationships. Shed already built preliminary cases against Miranda for insurance fraud and elder abuse, but she needed concrete evidence of more serious crimes to justify major felony charges. Our cooperation gave her access to 5 years of carefully documented evidence that transformed her investigation from speculation into an airtight case for multiple homicides. When Miranda arrived for the meeting, she brought her entire family with her, clearly intending this to be a public humiliation that would mark my complete defeat and submission. Richard looked uncomfortable but determined, obviously still believing that he was protecting his family from a dangerous daughter who had finally been brought to justice. Sienna and Blake wore expressions of smug satisfaction, probably looking forward to watching me grovel for forgiveness and accept responsibility for crimes I'd never committed. I played my role perfectly, appearing broken and defeated as I explained that I was ready to confess to everything that accused me of and sign whatever documents were necessary to make amends for the pain it caused the family. I apologized for stealing jewelry I'd never seen, admitted to behavioral problems I'd never exhibited, and accepted responsibility for financial losses that had never actually occurred. Miranda looked so satisfied with my performance that she couldn't resist elaborating on exactly what crimes she believed I was confessing to. That's when she made her first major mistake, describing the allegedly stolen jewelry in detail that proved Shed never actually owned the pieces in question. The diamond necklace she claimed I'd taken was supposedly a family heirloom passed down through generations of her relatives, but the description she gave matched a piece that had been sold at auction 3 years earlier and was currently owned by a collector in Switzerland. Her story about when the theft occurred also changed several times during our conversation, shifting from weeks ago to months ago to ongoing criminal activity over multiple years. As Miranda became more comfortable and confident in what she believed was her moment of complete victory, she started revealing information that only someone with intimate knowledge of my grandmother's murder could possibly know. She described my grandmother's final moments in detail that supposedly came from imagination, but included specific facts that had never been made public and could only have been witnessed by someone who was present during the actual crime. She talked about my grandmother's final words, the position of her body when it was discovered, and physical evidence that proved this wasn't the natural death it had appeared to be. The most damning revelation came when Miranda started describing her plans for my future, explaining how the conservatorship would allow the family to properly manage what she called Evelyn's hidden assets that Id obviously inherited but been too mentally ill to access properly. She talked about offshore accounts and foreign property holdings that weren't mentioned in any of the official documentation, proving that she'd known all along that the public will had been a deception designed to hide the real extent of my grandmother's fortune. But Miranda's biggest mistake was trusting Sterling Price to carry out the assassination plan without keeping proper operational security. She started bragging about how professionally the situation had been handled, describing the accident that would soon resolve all of the family's problems permanently. She explained how my suicide would be discovered in a way that generated maximum sympathy for the family, while eliminating any possibility of future legal challenges to their inheritance of my grandmother's estate. Richard's reaction to learning about the planned murder was everything Id hoped it would be and more. The man who had been manipulated into betraying his own daughter suddenly understood exactly what kind of woman Head married and what she was capable of doing to protect her stolen fortune. He started questioning other aspects of Miranda's story, asking why she needed to kill me if I was already mentally incompetent and legally powerless. His growing horror at Miranda's casual discussion of murder finally broke through the psychological manipulation that had controlled him for years. When Miranda realized that Richard was no longer completely under her control, she pulled out a pistol that she'd apparently been carrying as insurance against exactly this kind of situation. Her calm discussion of murder suddenly became desperate threats against anyone who might interfere with her plans or expose what she'd done to secure her position in the family. She demanded that everyone in the room sign documents transferring ownership of various assets to her personally, threatening to shoot anyone who refused to cooperate with her demands. That's when Detective Santos and her backup team burst into the conference room. Having heard more than enough to justify arrests for conspiracy to commit murder, confession to previous homicides, and multiple counts of fraud and theft, Miranda's attempt to destroy the evidence by shooting the recording equipment only added additional felony charges and provided even more proof of her consciousness of guilt regarding the crimes she'd just confessed to committing. The aftermath of Miranda's arrest was swift and decisive. Sienna and Blake, faced with evidence of their participation in the conspiracy against me, immediately began cooperating with investigators in hopes of receiving reduced sentences for their roles in the crimes. Richard, confronted with proof of what Miranda had done and what she'd been planning to do, finally understood the magnitude of his betrayal and began the long process of trying to make amends for the damage Head helped cause. Sterling Price was arrested at his hotel room just hours after the conference room confrontation, carrying equipment that would have been used to stage my suicide and detailed plans for disposing of any evidence that might link the crime back to Miranda. His cooperation with investigators revealed the full scope of Miranda's criminal network and provided evidence for additional charges related to other suspicious deaths in her past. The revelation of my grandmother's real will and the transfer of her fortune to my control was almost anticlimactic after everything that had happened, but it provided the resources necessary to fund proper investigations into Miranda's previous crimes and ensure that justice would be served for all of her victims. More importantly, it validated my grandmother's faith in my ability to survive Miranda's attacks and emerge strong enough to carry on the family legacy of success and moral integrity. The legal proceedings that followed Miranda's arrest moved with surprising speed, partly because her confession had been so comprehensive, and partly because Detective Santos had been building cases against her for years before our evidence provided the missing pieces she needed for successful prosecution. Miranda was ultimately charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, multiple counts of fraud and identity theft, and racketeering charges that carried potential life sentences, even if the murder charges somehow failed to result in conviction. The trial became a media sensation as details of Miranda's elaborate schemes and the scope of her criminal network were revealed to the public. Her previous husband's death was reclassified as homicide after exhumation revealed traces of the same poison that had killed my grandmother, and additional victims were identified through investigation of her financial activities and insurance claims over the past decade. What had started as a family dispute over inheritance had exposed a serial killer who had been operating undetected for years. Sienna and Blake avoided serious prison time by cooperating fully with prosecutors and providing detailed testimony about their mothers, criminal activities, and their own roles in the conspiracy against me. They both pleaded guilty to reduced charges and received sentences of 3 years in minimum security facilities, with the possibility of early release for good behavior and continued cooperation with ongoing investigations. Their willingness to testify against their mother provided crucial evidence about the premeditation and planning that had gone into multiple crimes. Richard's situation was more complicated because his victimization by Miranda's manipulation had to be balanced against his active participation in the conspiracy to have me declared mentally incompetent and potentially murdered. He ultimately pleaded guilty to fraud and conspiracy charges but received a suspended sentence in recognition of his cooperation and the psychological abuse had suffered during his marriage to Miranda. He was required to undergo extensive psychological counseling and make financial restitution for the damage his actions had caused to my life and reputation. The most satisfying aspect of the legal resolution was watching Miranda's careful facade finally crumble completely as the evidence against her mounted and her situation became hopeless. The composed, manipulative woman who had controlled my family for years became increasingly desperate and erratic, as she realized that all of her planning and all of her crimes had ultimately accomplished nothing except ensuring her own destruction. Her attempts to blame me for forcing her to commit crimes by refusing to cooperate with her plans only made her look more guilty and unrepentant. Tiffany's betrayal had legal consequences as well, since her participation in surveillance and evidence gathering made her an accessory to multiple felonies, including the planned murder conspiracy. She received 2 years in minimum security prison and substantial fines that wiped out whatever financial benefit Shed received from cooperating with Miranda. More importantly, the exposure of her role in the conspiracy destroyed her social relationships and academic prospects in ways that would have lasting consequences far beyond her prison sentence. Dallas Reagan and Wade Morrison, the private investigator and fake psychiatrist who had been key players in Miranda's schemes, both received significant prison sentences for their roles in the conspiracy. Their willingness to participate in what they knew was a criminal enterprise, including plans for murder, made them eligible for enhanced sentences under organized crime statutes. Their arrests also led to investigations of other cases where they'd provided similar services to different clients, exposing a broader network of criminal activity. The recovery of my grandmother's real fortune was emotionally overwhelming as well as financially significant. The Manhattan penthouse had been maintained exactly as Shed left it, filled with personal belongings and family photographs that told the story of our relationship and her hopes for my future. Reading her private papers and personal correspondence revealed the depth of her love for me and the extent of her planning to protect me from the dangers Shed foreseen in my future. The $50 million inheritance came with detailed instructions for how my grandmother had hoped I would use the money to honor her memory and continue her philanthropic work. Shed established foundations focused on supporting victims of domestic violence and elder abuse, causes that had obviously become personal for her as Shed uncovered the truth about Miranda's criminal activities. Managing these foundations gave me a sense of purpose and connection to my grandmother's values that went far beyond the financial security the inheritance provided. Clearing my name and restoring my reputation required extensive effort and considerable legal resources, but the truth about Miranda's frame-up and the evidence of my innocence eventually reached everyone who had been influenced by her lies. My university not only reinstated me with a full apology but also provided additional support to help me complete my degree despite the disruption the false accusations had caused. My professors and classmates who had believed Miranda's lies were universally apologetic and supportive once they understood what had really happened. The restoration of my relationship with my father was more complicated and painful than any legal proceeding. Richard's realization of how completely He'd been manipulated and how close He'd come to participating in my murder left him devastated with guilt and self-recrimination that took years of therapy to process. We both had to learn how to rebuild trust and communication that had been shattered by Miranda's psychological manipulation and the terrible choices had made under her influence. The house where I'd grown up was sold, with the proceeds donated to victims' rights organizations as a way of ensuring that some good came from the place where so much planning and plotting against innocent people had occurred. Richard moved to a small apartment and focused on rebuilding his life and his relationship with me, while Sienna and Blake eventually relocated to different states after their release from prison and tried to build new lives away from the scandal that surrounded their family name. 5 years after that frozen Christmas Eve, when my father locked me out and my grandmother's spirit guided me to the truth, I stand in the living room of her Manhattan penthouse, looking out at the city lights and reflecting on how completely my life has changed. The scared, isolated young woman who had nowhere to turn when her family betrayed her has become someone strong, confident, and capable of protecting herself and others from the kind of predatory behavior that had nearly destroyed my life. The transformation has been painful and difficult, but it's also been liberating in ways I could never have imagined. My relationship with my father has slowly healed, though it will never be the same as it was before Miranda's manipulation drove us apart. Richard has worked hard to understand how his desperation for companionship after my mother's death made him vulnerable to someone who specialized in exploiting lonely, grieving people. Has become an advocate for victims of psychological manipulation and financial abuse, using his own experience to help other families recognize the warning signs of predatory relationships before they reach the point of irreversible damage. The foundation I've established in my grandmother's memory has become one of the most effective organizations in the country for investigating and prosecuting elder abuse cases. We've helped secure convictions against dozens of people like Miranda who prey on vulnerable seniors, and we've recovered millions of dollars in stolen assets for victims and their families. The work gives me a sense of purpose that goes far beyond personal satisfaction. It's a way of ensuring that my grandmother's death led to protection for other potential victims. My education was completed with highest honors, and I've gone on to earn advanced degrees in both psychology and criminal justice that help me understand the mindset of people like Miranda and develop better strategies for identifying and stopping them before they can cause irreparable harm. The university that once suspended me based on her lies has become one of my strongest supporters, providing research facilities and academic resources that enhance the foundation's investigative capabilities. The Manhattan penthouse has become both my home and the headquarters for the foundation's work. Every room holds memories of my grandmother and reminders of the values she tried to instill in me during our time together. Her personal library has become my favorite place to work and think, surrounded by books on business, philosophy, and psychology that shaped her understanding of human nature and motivated her commitment to protecting vulnerable people from exploitation. Miranda is serving multiple life sentences in maximum security prison, where she's shown no remorse for her crimes or acknowledgement of the pain she's caused to multiple families. Her appeals have all been unsuccessful, and additional charges are still being filed as investigators continue to uncover evidence of other murders and fraudulent schemes she perpetrated over the course of her criminal career. She'll never have another opportunity to hurt innocent people, which is the most important outcome of everything we went through to bring her to justice. Sienna and Blake have both attempted to rebuild their lives after serving their sentences, but their participation in Miranda's crimes and their betrayal of basic moral principles has made that process difficult and uncertain. Both have reached out to apologize for their role in what happened, and while I've accepted their apologies, I've also made it clear that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or trusting them with any significant role in my life going forward. The most unexpected development in my recovery has been finding love and building a healthy relationship with someone who understands the importance of honesty, loyalty, and genuine emotional support. Meeting James during my graduate studies showed me what real partnership looks like, completely different from the manipulation and betrayal that had characterized my family relationships during Miranda's reign of terror. Our relationship is built on mutual respect and shared values rather than the emotional manipulation and financial calculation that drove Miranda's behavior. The Christmas Eve that began this entire ordeal has become a meaningful anniversary for me, marking not just the night when my world fell apart but also the moment when my grandmother's spirit reached across death to give me the tools I needed to fight back and reclaim my life. Every year on that date, I visit her grave and tell her about the progress we've made in protecting other families from predators like Miranda and helping victims recover from similar betrayals. The lesson that took me longest to learn was that sometimes the people who hurt us most are also the people who teach us the most about our own strength and resilience. Miranda's attempt to destroy me ultimately revealed capabilities and determination I never knew I possessed, while my father's betrayal taught me the importance of maintaining my own moral compass, even when everyone around me seems to have lost theirs. My grandmother's wisdom and planning gave me the tools I needed, but the victory was earned through my own willingness to fight for justice even when the odds seemed impossible. As I watched the snow beginning to fall outside my window on this Christmas Eve, exactly 6 years after everything started, I think about how much has changed and how much my grandmother would approve of the woman I've become. The scared girl who was locked out in the cold has become someone who can face any challenge and protect herself and others from the kind of evil that once seemed overwhelming and impossible to defeat. The foundation continues to grow and evolve, taking on cases that seemed hopeless and bringing justice to victims who thought they'd never see their abusers held accountable for their crimes. Every successful prosecution and every recovered asset represents another victory for my grandmother's memory and another step toward the kind of world she envisioned, where predators can't operate with impunity and vulnerable people have advocates strong enough to stand up to even the most sophisticated criminal schemes. What happened to my family was a tragedy that could have destroyed all of us, but it also became a catalyst for positive change that has protected countless other families from similar destruction. The inheritance my grandmother left me was never just about money. It was about responsibility, purpose, and the obligation to use whatever advantages we have to protect people who can't protect themselves from those who would exploit their vulnerabilities. So let me know in the comments what you think about family betrayal and whether you believe people can really change after doing terrible things to the people they claim to love. Have you ever experienced betrayal from someone you trusted completely? How did you find the strength to fight back and rebuild your life? Hit that like button if this story resonated with your own experiences with family drama, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about overcoming impossible odds and finding justice when the system seems stacked against you. Share this video with anyone who might be dealing with their own family betrayal or manipulation, because sometimes knowing you're not alone is the first step toward finding the courage to fight back. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it gives you strength to face whatever challenges you might be dealing with in your own life. Remember that even in the darkest moments, there's always hope for justice and healing if you're willing to fight for it. Merry Christmas to everyone watching, and may your families be filled with genuine love rather than the manipulation and betrayal that once defined mine.